We always say guns don't kill people, but what do we do if a gun might be the problem?
The New England take.
So excited today to be joined by Professor of Law Seth Oranburg, the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. Thanks so much for reaching out with this very interesting law that has recently passed in New Hampshire.
Absolutely. New Hampshire is famous for its interesting laws.
Yes,
Talked about them many times.
This is a prime example for sure, especially with the Republicans in office. So let's start at the cause for this law even being brought forward. So what is the legend of the self-firing P320 from Sig Sauer, and why is it such a big deal that this firearm may be having these problems?
Well, I'm going to maybe do a little show and tell with you today because, full disclosure, I'm an owner of a Sig P320. So I have one here. By the way, it's clear. There's no magazine in the chamber. Just to make sure we're safe here. I'm not going to have any ammunition nearby. But I want to talk through this a little bit because I think it's pretty relevant to the story. So this is a particular edition of it. But this firearm was adopted by the U.S. military with a safety, which is one of the requirements for the military's firearm. And this gun, which you can purchase as a civilian in New Hampshire, which obviously I am and own, does not have a safety mechanism. So that's the key thing, is right around here on the firearm, for your viewers here, there would be something you operate, like a little lever, and that lever would prevent the firing mechanism from engaging, and that's not a feature of this gun. I say not a feature as opposed to a bug, because what we can talk about is a little bit about why this has been so controversial. But Sig Sauer is a major manufacturer. They're located here in New Hampshire. It's a big business here. You know, folks like me who are local might prefer this firearm because of some preference for it having Exeter and Newington written on the side of it. But it's a very important weapon because it was adopted by the military, but adopted in a format that had a safety. And then they came out with a version for civilians that does not have a thumb safety. And the very short version of our story is a lot of the controversy circulates around that. So what I might do with you today is talk about, what is this? Why, like, the word safety sort of sounds good, right? Like, why would anyone in their right minds, much less a law professor who might not be, purchase a weapon without a safety? So I think that's where the law becomes pretty influential.
And to me, one of the big things that comes from this, you talk about, it's one of the most widely used guns when it comes to law enforcement, the military, things like that. A lot of these people will tend to want to have the same gun personally also. So it's the same people that probably have the gun with the safety probably also have it personally because they want to have that consistency going from one to the other. And I'm going to put in a video, a clip at some point of an example of one of these malfunctions that his video evidence that it wasn't a malfunction in this situation, where it was literally because it doesn't have a safety. Might have been used to having a safety when he's using it as his service weapon, something of that nature. And you go into the economics of scale sometimes with issues like that. You have more of a certain weapon out there with a population that's more likely to be training and practicing the use of said weapon because of what they do for their professional life, that you're just more likely to have this issue come up, especially when maybe these individuals are used to the weapon being a certain way when they're on the clock versus when they're not on the clock.
Yeah. When I made a decision to purchase a firearm to defend my family here in my home, this is just again to kind of point out with our show and tell, this is a large weapon. It's not something I would attempt to conceal carry. It's not something I'm going to take anywhere. It's something that I keep in a thumbprint identified safe box. That was a decision I made after the Tree of Life shooting happened to my Jewish community in Pittsburgh. And the Jewish community, realizing that we were vulnerable to armed assailants coming into our communities and our homes, who frankly wanted to murder us because of our identity, that was a wake-up call for a lot of Jewish individuals, and I'm sure other people, to think about that. But I didn't have any experience. I don't have any military service, except when I was in like 7th and 8th grade, I was in the Seabees program for junior, very, very junior naval cadets. I spent 2 weeks at Fort Benning. It was awesome, by the way. But, I have no experience. So when I went to choose a firearm, the fact that the U.S. military had selected one was a really big deal for me. And it really just came down to two choices. There was the Glock 19, which is, famous for being a popular choice, and the Sig Sauer P320, which the military had adopted. And at that time, a New Hampshire resident, I selected the local option as opposed to the Austrian option with some American pride, I'm sure. But it also has a couple features that made me feel more safe. So, for example, one thing that I chose about this gun when I went to look for it is, and this is also part of that safety, is that you can actually disassemble the gun and clean it without pulling the trigger. And that's the number one way people injure themselves. With a Glock, you actually have to pull the trigger to the rear, and which, if there's a bullet in the chamber, it would operate the gun. So people injure themselves cleaning Glocks. So one reason I chose this is actually for its safety features. And like I mentioned, being fairly ignorant, I thought, well, if the military picked it as their choice, that's good enough for me, for the rare instance that I have a home invasion situation and just want something that operates. But as you pointed out, law enforcement officers who might be used to what I have been told is called, a battery of arms, like a method of operating a firearm. There's a very particular way that you go about presenting a firearm. And if you have a safety, that has been trained into you. And there are things you can do with a gun with a safety, maybe not recommended, but a gun with a safety means that if you pull the trigger, it won't operate unless the safety is disengaged. But again, a feature, not a bug. If you pull the trigger on this gun, and again, I have an unloaded gun on the table that we checked and we cleared, and there's no ammunition within arm's reach, so I just want to be clear about that if I pick it up again. This gun is designed so that you don't have to, I didn't want to have to develop that skill of learning to remember to, unsafety the gun for firing, because one major reason why, at least in my research, citizens lose in firefights is that, you get really flustered. I have no military training. I need something that's really simple to operate. So to me, that was a feature and not a bug.
Let's start diving into what went on with this law. So it pissed off a bunch of Democrats for many reasons, but two in particular. One reason is it was put in during quiet time when there were less people over at the State House, and it went through pretty quickly without debate. And number two, they want to ban the guns. I'll just say it. Democrats, they don't like the guns. That's a big part of the PR issue that Republicans always have to navigate when it comes to doing anything when it comes to a gun. But when it's specifically a manufacturer in particular that has received a bunch of headlines, whether or not legitimate, it doesn't really matter. The fact it was a specific firearms manufacturer that was given an exception that is known for supporting particular candidates in the state that are of the right and very pro-gun, it raises all sorts of red flags for people. Generally speaking, what was the law about that made it through?
The headlines, and maybe we should fact check this together a little bit. People say that this law targeted, or maybe that's the wrong term, targeted, but I don't know, protected, defended, shielded Sig Sauer. That's actually not what the law says, right? So what the law says is that a manufacturer, the pertinent part, the part we care about is that a manufacturer is not liable under tort law because the gun does not have a safety on it, because of the absence of safety features, right? Not all safety features, but the particular, and again, I'm going to kind of point this out here, right? The particular absence that on a gun there would be traditionally a mechanism here that you would use to make the gun safe or unsafe. The absence of that feature is not a basis for liability for the manufacturer of this gun. And it's actually the case that many manufacturers, in fact, I would be hard pressed to find, I think, if I did research, a gun manufacturer that made a pistol didn't offer a pistol that didn't have this particular feature, because technology has developed significantly since the mechanism has been introduced. And Glock, again, would also be a beneficiary of this same law. So I just don't think it's true that the law targets or protects SIG in particular, except for the fact that the lawsuits currently happening tend to be about SIG being liable because they say the gun has gone off without operator motion. So I just want to be like really clear about what the law says. The law would protect a manufacturer who does not put a safety on a gun. It doesn't say Sig Sauer is immune from lawsuits, right? That's someone else's headline. That's their version. That's an analysis. This is the important portion of the bill. So HB551 says, in any product liability action involving a firearm, the manufacturer of the firearm and any federal firearm licensee who sold or transferred the firearm shall not be liable in tort under any theory of defective product design, failure to warn, negligence, strict product liability, or any other claim based on the absence or presence of any of the following features. A magazine disconnect mechanism. B, a loaded chamber indicator. C, authorized user recognition technology. Or D, an external mechanical safety, including but not limited to a hinged, pivoting, or tabbed trigger safety. So that's the bill language that people are saying protects Sig Sauer. And what I want to get across is that many manufacturers have the absence of those same features. And there are reasons why a responsible gun owner who is concerned about protecting his family in the instance of a home invasion would prefer a firearm that lacks a thumb safety.
For the record, we just edited out like 10 minutes of us searching around to find the actual bill. This bill is not directly referenced in any of the news articles, really, and you got to go specifically to Gen Court. So look down in the episode description. I'll have a link to the actual passed bill that Governor Ayotte did sign. So you can actually see what's going on with it. This is another example of media manipulation, and they're trying to play games with the headlines or the clickbait and things like that. Almost no one from the right has covered this. I'll do a quick search to see if NH Journal did, and I'll put that in the edit when I put the video together. But like this is something that goes far beyond, and these are features that ultimately, if Democrats came in office, would try and create laws to bear down on the gun rights of people in New Hampshire. So this is also, in addition to protecting Sig Sauer, in theory, is also protecting gun owners in general from future regulations that Democrats may put down.
Well, and the firearm transferee. So this is also notably, so there's a concept in tort law of strict liability. So that if there's a defect, and here's the key thing, AJ, is that we got to get back to the law for a minute here, is because, I'm not an expert on the firearm, but I'm just, full disclosure, like I selected this particular firearm given my absence of, significant training, right? Because of the fact that it had this lack of features or these features. But what we're talking about really here is tort law, right? Tort law is the law that would govern. Criminal law could come into play too, but notably tort law here is where a person is liable for money damages for harm caused to another person. And the issue with tort law is that there can be strict liability for defective products. So if this gun, the P320, is defective, that means that there is a chain of liability that is virtually unlimited, that touches everyone who was in the chain of the sale of that firearm. It could range all the way up to the manufacturers of parts that went into the gun, to Sig Sauer itself, to the distributors and things like that. So it's a pretty sweeping damnation, and would open the door to a lot of litigation. And this kind of product liability litigation is a field day for plaintiffs' lawyers. Like, you could look it up, but how many billions have been made on asbestos litigation, and things like that. So when products are found to be defective and that they hurt people, or you can come up with other examples. But I think what's important here are two things. One is on the factual basis that there hasn't been any case that shows that this is a defective. A defective weapon would be one that fires without user input. That is in fact a defect. Like, a firearm should never go bang unless the trigger is pulled. And I don't use passive voice very often, but the trigger is pulled is a deliberate use of passive voice, because the trigger can be pulled for a couple of reasons, including a really sloppy reholstering process.
Some guy brought to our attention the other day. I got sent a video by Achilles Heel Tactical. Rick and those guys over there doing fantastic stuff. He's a brilliant knowledge transfer specialist. You guys have not checked out his content. But there was an issue on his flat range. Everybody's on the yard line. He's demoing something, and all of a sudden you hear boom. Look down the yard line, just a bunch of students, and you hear him say, "Is it that fucking 320?" Already a negative install, and he said, "You know, it went off in the holster." My issue with that is you can't see it. And just full transparency, we were running a KT course out here 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, about 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago, we had a guy, badass class, start to finish. Everybody was super honest, super safe, super transparent, and really ready to train. And we had a guy, one of the top cheaters in a class, full-time guy, full-time SWAT team dude, who trains his ass off, definitely one of the top shooters in a class. He had an AD in the holster. And it's right next to me doing a drill, and I don't even catch it because it happened so fast. We got the whole thing on video. But I asked him, as soon as it happened, and I realized what it was your finger on the trigger? And he looked me right in the eyes. He said, "No, nope, I didn't do it. Went off by itself."
So, you know, when you choose to purchase a gun like this, in fact, when you choose to purchase any guns, you know, guns, I don't know what the expression, you know, guns do kill. I mean, people kill people with guns. Like, guns and death are associated because bullets cause fatal injuries to human beings. And then any decision to purchase a firearm is a serious decision, and any gun owner should take serious responsibility for that decision. You know, as I mentioned, in my case, you know, the decision was that, you know, I mean, forget about a holster. I keep it in like literally a lockbox. Like Al Gore would be proud of this, you know, this is my lockbox with the fingerprint identification, you know, you know, that's how I sort of maintain it. So, you know, it may not be appropriate for all, you know, uses. And in fact, I think that's why the U.S. military insisted on having a safety, because of the way the military trains its combatants to operate with their firearms. But nothing that I've seen suggests that this gun goes off unless you pull the trigger to the rear. Now,
yeah, there's been tons of lawsuits when it comes to this too, and if someone's had that magic bullet to say that this is the cause of it, everyone would see it. It would be all over YouTube. Every gun YouTuber would be like, "We got him, boys."
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
And it just doesn't exist. I actually went back to, like, Grantham is a very popular gun YouTuber, and he did a drop test, and they were throwing this gun from on top of a shipping container aggressively in every angle. Could not get the damn thing to go off. Well, I believe the 1911 did, because it's a really old gun with dated safety features built in that the SIG has.
Guns like 1911s, which have thumb safeties, are not drop safe without the safety engaged. So, look, I mean, there was, first off, that we go back to some history here. When I shopped this around, you know, there were questions that I had about becoming a first-time gun owner and how to make a responsible purchase. And, you know, one of those was, you know, at the time, this stuff about the 320. And it did, now, as I mentioned, the history of the 320 was originally, it was a military gun, the M17, and a shorter version, the M18. And those versions for the military have thumb safeties. And when they ported that into a consumer version, the initial versions, from what I understand, were not drop safe. And SIG confirmed that. So they issued a product recall. They manually or voluntarily replaced the internal mechanism, you know, which elevated to become drop safe. And you know, there are technical videos on this which would explain things like the sear and what have you. But when I entered the market to purchase a firearm with the knowledge that this had already occurred and that they had made the gun drop safe. And so I think that's part of, you know, but look, once you get a bad reputation, it's hard to gain that trust back. So I think that is point number one, is that it is fair to say the gun may not have been drop safe initially when it first came on the market. And that's no bueno, right? So, but that should have been addressed. And again, that's not the claim. The claim here is not that there's some issue with a lack of drop safety. The claim is that the issue goes off uncommanded. And that's where there's no proof. And, you know, to win a torts case, but you can really beat somebody up pretty good with lawsuits, even if you don't have proof.
Yeah, I mean, they've had at least hundreds of lawsuits when it comes to this across the country, because a lot of them are at the state court level. So the NHPR article that I'll link down below if you want to check out one take on the situation. It's fairly in-depth, but it does show a bit of both sides on it, even if they don't reference the actual law, which is mind-blowing. The attorney, like, no one's got anything. That's what kills me about this whole thing. Like, it's totally rumor mill and no evidence to specifically show that Sig Sauer is at fault. Yes, they did have that initial issue. It's probably a big part of it. You get people gabbing about it. The gun community loves to talk about guns, so things spread wildly. Well, and here we are.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you my personal story, right? Kind of going back to my personal relationship with, becoming a firearm owner is you try to get advice from people that you trust. And I had mentioned I went out, bought a Sig P320, one that, after the serial numbers had changed because they had addressed the drop safety issue. And one of my friends who was in the Israeli military for like 22 years and has a lot of experience, although older, right? Has a very, has a different battery of arms, as we would say, came from a different era. He went to help me with some training and to give me some advice on shooting. And he basically saw that I had a P320 and was like, you have to get rid of that firearm. That's not a safe gun. It's not a safe gun. And he basically was like, convinced me that like that gun could go off like at any time, at any warning because of whatever he'd read on the internet. And I sold it. And I actually purchased a Glock because I was convinced. And, I actually found the Glock so difficult to use, and I hated the fact that I had to pull the trigger to clean it. Because frankly, that whole aspect of it, of having to I never want to pull the trigger on a gun unless I want that gun to fire. And I hated that operational feature. And it made me not want to clean the gun or to operate the gun because other people are bolder than I am. But just, that notion that you have to, I don't want to pull the trigger on a firearm unless it's either pointed downrange at something that's made of paper or God forbid, an intruder that's threatening my life and that I intend to destroy. So, this had a feature that I wanted. Plus, the Glock didn't shoot as well and was not as good a gun. So actually, I bought it back. Not it's the same gun, but I bought it again later, having done a significant research on whether or not this was a real issue and whether I felt safe for my use case. Now, my use case, again, is I keep it in a literal lockbox with a thumbprint safety, located in a secure aspect area in my house. I don't carry this firearm. I don't carry it on my belt. I don't take it out and reholster it. When I'm using it at a range to train, I'll deplete the magazine. I'll triple check it before putting it away. And so that's my, battery of arms, right? That's my approach to it. For others that have a different use case, some people carry guns in their pockets. I think this is a bad idea, by the way, not that I'm here to give advice, but, carrying a gun in your pocket is dangerous because your keys could pull the trigger, it could snag. This would be a terrible thing. This is obviously, it's not designed for that. It's not made for that purpose. And if you're used to that, though, or if you're used to pocket carry in the summertime with your gun with your safety on it, and you just operate this gun without learning how to use it properly, that's extremely dangerous. But it's not the fault of the manufacturer. I think that's the key thing. These are hazardous products. You should buy one if you intend to use it safely. You could absolutely kill yourself with a firearm. There's no question about it. It's an incredibly dangerous product. The fact that, we can have another discussion around why we permit them in society, but there's no question that if you go out and buy a gun, you should be aware that you should know how to operate it. And in this case, the way to operate it is that it goes into a custom-made holster that's designed to fit snugly around the trigger, because it lacking any other kind of safety, you must maintain it in a way that the trigger cannot be depressed without intentionality. Again, in my case, this is a box that is a foot by 8 inches. That's not very convenient. For people that wear it on a holster, it should be a holster which is designed for the gun. And by the way, for the gun, probably without a weapon light. That's the other thing to sort of mention around this. So, Again, I'll kind of go back to the show and tell, right? So the concept here is if you pull the trigger on the gun will fire. Not in this condition because, again, it's safe, right? We've cleared it several times. But that also means that if you need to have a holster which completely makes it impossible for this trigger to be pulled in any way while you're carrying it. And if you put a light on the front of the gun, the light could have a larger circumference than the gun itself. And that would mean that the hole of the holster is large enough that other objects can fit into it. So, again, like this is not the right option for every person. If you feel like you need to carry a weapon light because you're literally carrying this around for duty, this may be a bad choice because something like your keys can get into that holster. But I don't think that's Sig Sauer's fault. They made this gun for someone like me who wants this thing is 42 ounces and lives in a box on my drawer, right? I'm the use case for that. If you choose to use it for something else, that's, I think, a matter of taking responsibility. AJ, there's just one more thing about safety. First off, the word saying safety makes you think a gun would be safer with a safety. But one thing that I know from working with people is sometimes, because it's inconvenient, people don't engage the safety on a gun. And a gun designed to have a safety engage that does not have that safety engaged is much worse than a gun that does not have that built in as a feature. Because as you mentioned, the idea of drop safe, that's no longer a drop safe gun. And because the whole design is built around operating that safety, you have to build that into your battery of arms, into the way that you treat a firearm. So I get it. Like, people hear the word safety and they're like, why would you get rid of a safety on a gun? And I think my point is, well, there are actually reasons that those safeties can make guns less safe because of how people really operate them. So just don't get hung up on the verbiage. I think it's a mechanism to ensure that the gun does not fire unless deliberately operated. And there are other mechanisms that do that same thing.
Professor Seth Oranburg, UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law, thanks so much for joining me today on this.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Don't, as always, we always say, don't necessarily believe everything you see in the headlines. Be sure to look a little deeper. And guess what? New Hampshire's Gen Court actually lists all the laws. If you don't think things are quite right that you're looking at online, definitely go check out it's gc.nh.gov. If you do Google search, you'll come up with the laws. You just need to try and find the bill number and the year specifically. There's a lot of lines, but it's an outline. You can figure out what you're looking at without having a law degree. So be sure to always investigate to see what they're saying in the articles are always 100% accurate as to what's going on. All right, NewEnglandTake.com. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Big thank you to the Granite Grok for sharing the show every Saturday on their podcast listings too, so you can check us out on there and all major podcast platforms. We'll talk to you soon.